This platform is to create a space where we can disseminate information on the G20 to colleagues in media, and also have an opportunity to discuss amongst ourselves what will the summit mean for South Africa, for the continent, and for the globe. So without further ado, let's us get going at our panel discussion.
Growth is a lot lower than we expected. Europe is struggling, Germany is struggling, everyone knows that. So what the G20 really are trying to focus on with creating 1.8% or what they say 2% more growth with their 900 policy reform action plan would seem like a pie in the sky, if I could put it as bluntly as that. But the truth of the matter is that they're trying to incorporate every individual country, and the reading through all their policy documents over the last couple of years, the emphasis has been placed on individual country. If you believe in austerity, yes, believe in austerity, but use reforms in another way to reach these growth targets. And if you have a bit of more fiscal leniency, use that fiscus to do the infrastructure that is needed. And we're probably later going to talk about employment to create the jobs that are necessary. One thing that I also wanted to show out is what they've said. The feeling was that the power of the G20 to institutionalize these great concepts of increasing growth might be in the past, something of the past now. And I think Australia did a tremendous job at rekindling this confidence that not only consumers but producers and investors are looking for. We have all this money. We know about the South African banks themselves generating or having all this cash, not wanting to invest in the long term. We know pension funds struggling, looking for growth particularly. And what countries have reached is this point where we see monetary and fiscal policy has almost ran its course, if I can be as bold to say that. Budget deficits are too high, and we all know debt is too high, but on a monetary policy perspective, rates are going towards zero. Most of the developing world's yields are as low as they've ever been, and this creates the question, why do we not see the demand? Why do we not see the investment? Which I'll probably touch on later again. The reform policies, they talk a lot about inclusive growth, which I really like, and how they want to pull small, medium enterprises into this inclusive growth by making them part of the global value chain. And that's really what I'm looking forward to, is how they are going to materialize these concepts, these policies that they have put into place. And I think that's what, from a growth perspective, everybody is waiting for, these individual countries and their action plans, and how the president is going to address these issues of reform of fiscal and monetary policy, as they've started doing in October already. What I really like about the idea is the accountability factor. There was a lot of questions at the October meeting about China's contribution. Are they reforming as they should be? And John Hockey actually said that they're reforming even more so, which I really appreciated. So accountability is a real factor. There's not a chance for people to try and come to the table and say, this is what we're going to deliver, and not deliver on that. And then the other thing is what I also appreciate from a growth perspective is the contributions that they introduced business, they introduced civil society, they introduced labor, they introduced the youth, and all these different non-governmental organizations to say, yes, we want to see this organization work, we want to see growth going forward, we need employment, we know that. And they've reached a conclusion and that they want to drive it through business. And from there, I think I'll touch on later of how they want to utilize business, and can socialist economies or countries that are a bit more left, can they also utilize business in this way to reach the growth objectives that are in front of them?
We want the Brisbane Action Plan to make a commitment to address inequality, to promote inclusive, equitable, and sustainable growth policies. So what we've seen during the course of Australia as the president of the G20 this past year is a very restricted kind of framing of growth, speaking specifically to a job-rich, strong, and sustainable balanced growth. But with inequality rising, and G20 being home to more than half the world's poorest people, The G20 needs to heed warnings from organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the OECD. These institutions acknowledge that inequality derails poverty alleviation and threatens economic growth. Tax is one of the key areas that the G20 has been focusing this past year with the project of the OECD Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, that's called BEPS in short. And what we've seen over the past year, and civil society has been quite engaged in monitoring the developments. We were recently in June at the Civil 20 Summit in Melbourne, and there are calls from civil society globally for more inclusivity in the BEPS process of developing countries, especially Africa. Because what's happening is that developing countries like in Africa are not being part of the negotiations. The OECD has had some consultations, but in terms of the true engagement and how the input of developing countries will really be reflected is still being questioned. We don't know exactly, in terms of the outcomes, how developing countries' interests will be part of this process of reforming the international tax system if they're not part of the negotiating table. So apart from civil society making calls for more inclusivity, in October 2014, a group of financial ministers from low-income countries in Francophone Africa also made a statement for a more legitimate process to reform the international tax system. It needs to address inequality, the lack of justice, and revenue from governments. They also highlighted the issue of tax competition being quite problematic. So, in terms of the BEPS process, Oxfam is calling for a worldwide tax transparency that's public, that includes public country-by-country reporting. This reporting is so that information on sales and profits, physical assets and employees are provided not to just tax administrators, which is where we're seeing the G20 making some progress, but to the public, so that we can hold companies to account and also deal with the issue of tax havens to try to deter illicit flows from leaving the African continent. And just to put some statistics on what's happening on illicit flows, Oxfam estimates $100 billion tax revenues lost each year because of tax avoidance in developing countries. And in terms of our region in sub-Saharan Africa, from 2008 to 2010, an estimate of $72 billion US per year was also lost due to illicit flows, and this is double the amount of aid, overseas development aid assistance sub-Saharan Africa receives. So in times of ODA dwindling, this is a real crucial time for Africa and other developing countries to watch what's happening in terms of BEPS. We welcome what the G20 has been doing, but we're calling for more inclusion of developing countries so that their interests are also on the table, and that they can also be part of the negotiations for reform of the international tax system. Thanks.
I'm just going to touch on a few issues focusing on the labour market areas of the G20 debate. And I think the first significant step that we need to note at the G20 is that for the first time we're seeing organizations that were often criticizing each other coming together and preparing joint papers on key issues pertaining to the labour market. For example, the ILO is working very closely with the OECD, the World Bank and the IMF in producing papers that are going to be discussed and have been discussed at the G20. So what we're finding is that the labour market and the macroeconomic thinkers are coming together and realizing that they need to work together rather than separately in finding solutions on the way forward. I think in a microcosm we find in the business world, too often human resources and the things attached to people are perhaps an unnecessary evil for line managers, and they tend to focus on what they do is best, making profits. And I think at this macro G20 debate, it's quite clear that there has to be this joint effort. I'd like to just quote on one of the documents, and really captures it far better than I can say. Robust economic growth and quality job creation are intertwined goals that can only be achieved through coherent and mutually reinforcing strategies that use macroeconomic and financial levers to foster stronger growth and employment, and social policies to maintain aggregate demand by supporting employment and earnings. And I think the trick is going to be from the G20 is how can emerging economies like South Africa and those who aren't part of the G20 that can grasp what they're telling us in terms of taking home and implementing. There's no magic wand that's going to come from these G20 debates with the miraculous answer to the poverty, the inequality, and the issues that we're dealing with, particularly in South Africa. But what there's going to be is some solid debate around these principles as to what's working where and how you can take it back into your respective economies, customize it, and make it work. There are two particular areas at the G20 which are being debated. The one is youth employment, which stands out across the world as an issue that needs to be dealt with, and how to deal with that specifically. Things like vocational training, apprenticeships stand out, many things which we aren't doing. And they give very practical examples in these debates as to what countries can do to deal with youth unemployment. And the second one is on gender and how gender mainstreaming can help in the different debates. But what's interesting, if you read the debate on gender, it's very different to what we experience in South Africa because of the shrinking labor markets of some of these G20 countries. They're finding they don't have adequate labor to deal with their economy and to manage their economy. So they're trying to promote more and more women into the marketplace because of their demand that they have. We don't have that challenge here. We've got exactly the opposite. We've got too much supply and too little skills base within the gender component. So the debate's going to happen there, but you have to really cherry pick out there what is relevant for your particular economy, because we're not the same as Germany and the countries that we're sitting with at the table. I'm not going to deal with the youth and the and gender issues. We can drill down on if it's necessary. But some of the key issues that are coming out of these debates is obviously dealing with working poverty, informal employment, youth, which I've mentioned, minimum wages, collective bargaining, social protection. These are some of the topics that are being debated and which are extremely relevant to the South African economy. What I'm disappointed in is that from the G20, South Africa is coming home and looking at certain areas that are being dealt with. And as soon as last week, on the 4th of November, there was a Labour Indaba that was led by our Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa. It hardly saw the light of day in the press. A few columns in some newspapers focused on the minimum wage debate, which is going to be a difficult one. But if one looks at the declaration of Ekurhuleni, which came out of that meeting with 5 ministers sitting with captains of industry, labour and community leaders that are going to address the very issues that are coming out of the G20 to match our labour market with our national development plan, which is where the G20 is telling countries to go. And I think that we need to start focusing on those positive areas in South Africa and realizing that our leaders are taking heed of what is said at the G20. And yes, we have a long way to go, but the fact is it's on the agenda, a process is put into place, and I think we need to focus our attention on what is happening in that debate in terms of our national policies. If one comes back to the G20 issues, the areas of growth that they are focusing on, and they have headings, and I'm just going to touch the headings rather than the substance, is they deal with consumption. And they have a very big concern about how economies are not empowering the lower end of the scale, the lower employees, by not dealing adequately with the wage issues on how they can provide and deal with the areas of growth through consumption. They look at investment policies, government revenue and spending. So very key macroeconomic issues are being dealt with in how to achieve growth in order to stimulate the growth of jobs. South Africa, the public employment programs, income support to the unemployed, investing in workers' skills, reducing inequality. These are 4 areas, once again, that the G20 will be spending time on. But as they say in their papers, each country is different. And so they're going to be talking rather generally and coming up with maybe a few examples of successes and highlighting areas of concern. But what they say in the conclusion, and I'd like to read in my last comment, a conclusion that they came to before going into the next meetings. The current situation calls for strong and well-designed employment, labour and social protection policies to address both cyclical and structural challenges applied in conjunction with supportive macroeconomic policy mixes. The effectiveness of such policies would greatly increase if actions are taken collectively at the G20 level in a coordinated manner. I think that even though the G20 are going to come up with some collective suggestions, in the South African context, we're going to have to come back and do it ourselves. I don't believe there's going to be handouts or anything, as I say, a magic wand coming out of the G20 debate. The hard graft is going to happen here, but we need to take heed of what they're advising at the G20 level and those countries that are achieving successes. They say until 2018, there's going to be a challenge globally with the ability to create jobs and to alleviate that particular problem. South Africa's big issue are things like the wage gap, the Gini coefficient there. It's horrific. If you read Anne Crotty, and there's a few authors on the book on corporate salaries and in South Africa, it's horrific reading. And if we don't sit down and tackle that, which is one of the issues they're talking about, then we certainly are losing the plot. Anyway, I can go on forever. I sound like a preacher. But there are many issues that are positively going to be debated, and South Africa is at the forefront of that and have the advantage of being there and coming back and seeing what we can do about it. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am going to talk a little bit more about procedure and politics. I think you've heard quite a lot about some of the substantive issues that are going to be on the G20 agenda for this summit, but I want to talk a little bit about the actual G20 itself as a process and what that means for South Africa and the rest of the African continent, and also the political context in which this summit is going to take place, which I think is always very important when you're looking at international relations and summitry. As was mentioned in the introduction, South Africa is the only core member or permanent member of the G20 from Africa. There are, in fact, only 19 countries in the G20. The 20th member is the European Union, which is, or the European Commission, if you like, which is a group of countries. There was talk originally that that would be a place for Nigeria, that they would, in fact, be the 20th country. But in the end, the Europeans won out, and there is fairly significant European domination of the group. This year in Australia, there will be 2 other African countries at the table. You'd get a prize for guessing who they are, quite frankly. One is Mauritania, who is the current chair of the African Union in 2014. And the other is Senegal, who will be there to represent the NEPAD's Heads of State Committee. This is a process that has been there for a number of years, since Korea hosted the G20. 2 other Africans have been invited to be part of the process. Together with a number of other guests. This year the Australians have also invited some of their neighbours, so New Zealand is there, Singapore is also going to be there. You have a representative from ASEAN, I think it's Myanmar in the chair of ASEAN at the moment, and you also always have Spain, funny enough. The Spanish are like a permanent guest of the G20, which goes back to my point about European domination of this grouping. So we've got 3 seats, in theory, at the table when we come to this summit process. But the problem is that summits are about political engagement, and on a lot of the very technical, substantive issues that we've heard spoken about here, on growth targets, on inequality, on tax, on employment, the work gets done well in advance of this meeting that will happen in Brisbane next week. You've heard Vic quote from some of the work that's been happening in the employment minister's space. The Australians have hosted over 60 G20 meetings in 2014 already. that is a massive commitment for any country to participate in a process of this nature. And so Mauritania and Senegal have not been part of the preparatory processes, if you like, leading up. They will simply turn up at this summit. So what does that actually mean from the point of view of Africa's participation in the G20? I think that the lack of African representation really does not actually reflect the relevance of the agenda for this continent. The G20 talks about a broad range of issues now, and most of them are either directly relevant for our own economic development objectives. So you've got issues such as infrastructure financing, which is a big challenge for us here, regional integration, tax is directly relevant for African countries, domestic resource mobilization, which is related to some of the tax debates, which is about how do we better get our own economies to generate revenue that the governments can use for our development. And indirectly, most of what the G20 talks about has some impact on us here. So it's not that the agenda is irrelevant. So what should we do about this? Our suggestion, and the suggestion of both the South African government as well as some of the other African institutions that have been involved in the G20, is that Africa needs to get better organized. We need to assume that the G20 is actually here to stay, that it's not a short-lived phenomenon of global politics, if you like, but that it is going to be a fora that's around for quite a long time, that it is an important agenda, as I've mentioned, that's very relevant for us. And so how can we therefore better participate in these processes? One suggestion is that the African Union Commission itself becomes more involved in this. You have this problem where these 2 extra African seats go to countries that change every year. So Mauritania is only the African Union chair for 1 year. So next year it's possibly going to be Zimbabwe, for example, if they take over as chair of the AU. They'll be in that spot for a year. So there's very little continuous capacity, continuous engagement. There's no opportunity to build up resources within some of these countries to participate in the debates. So therefore, the African Union Commission could potentially play that sort of supporting role. And that's one suggestion. I'm happy to talk a lot more about that, but I also just want to flag some of the issues to watch, I would call them, around what's going to be happening in Brisbane. There's been some very interesting standoffs happening in the media and posturing, if you like, by two of the leaders coming to the G20 between President Putin and the Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. And so that is going to be a very closely watched set of engagements, certainly by the Australian media, I think, who are anticipating some interesting moments perhaps there. Ebola has made it onto the G20 agenda. We've already seen the finance ministers make a statement from their last meeting in Cairns, looking at what the global response to Ebola should be or could be. And I expect there'll be ongoing discussions around Ebola. One that's of particular interest, I think, to the Australians, but also to myself, is the trade space. This will be an opportunity for a discussion amongst leaders about what has been a very difficult year in the World Trade Organization. And we've seen the Director General of the World Trade Organization calling on some political push around what has been a failure to be able to move forward with what was agreed in Bali at the end of last year around trade facilitation. So I think that trade will come up. And then the last one I would be watching for is climate change. This was a very interesting topic that whenever we were in Australia for engagements around the G20 this year, it was a big concern to the Australian domestic constituency. I'm sure Marianne, who is with us at some of these meetings, would back that up. And I think that what we've seen coming out of the APEC engagements just in the last day or so, potential agreements between the United States and China are setting the stage for some focus on climate change issues as well. And climate change was rated as the big global economic governance issue that has seen the least progress in 2014. by people who monitor these things out of Canada, a group called CG. Climate change had seen regression in 2014, according to them, and that financial regulation had been, in fact, the most promising area, which is where I think the G20 excels naturally, is in the finance space. So they would be the things I would be watching out for, is how Africa's voice is positioned. We know that President Zuma is not likely to be doing much engagements in Australia outside of the summit itself. So it's not going to be something that's turning into a bigger visit at this stage. It'll be very much focused on the G20 engagements. And then we look forward to Turkey takes over in 2015 as the chair of the G20.
Some of the issues have already been touched upon by the different speakers, especially when it comes to taxation. I think this is one of the most important instruments when it comes to developing economies of any country. And unfortunately for Africa, we have been plagued by low tax revenue bases over the past 25 years, looking at which has not actually been helpful in rolling out social protection programs, access to health, education, and water and sanitation, which are things that Africa is currently, as well as South Africa, is currently lacking. And it's quite important that this has come to the agenda at this point in time, although I think it should have always been on the agenda. If you look at the current status of tax systems in Africa, you have 13 to 15% contribution to GDP, as opposed to 35% for developed countries. And UN statistics actually estimates say that if we were to target 20% of GDP from tax revenue, would be able to actually alleviate poverty, which is actually very stubborn at this point in time. 1 in every 2 Africans is living below the poverty line in some of these estimates. So it's quite important that as we look for ways to mobilize domestic resources to finance our own development, taxation becomes critical. And this particular issue on the G20 comes at an opportune time that we need to capitalize on. Apart from the fact that capital flight and tax havens have actually contributed to the erosion of tax bases, we should also be mindful that within the continent, there's a whole lot of corruption and tax evasion. Very few people are paying taxes, and also the political and economic elite also avoid taxes because of abuse of power in certain instances. We have agricultural-based economies, and a whole lot of those people are quite poor, so it's quite difficult to actually tax them, as well as even the collection process itself becomes a costly process. We've got high levels of unemployment. The informal sector in certain countries is actually up to 80%. So also that poses challenges for tax collection. So it's quite things that are actually coming also on other fronts on the G20 agenda when you look at unemployment. And also other financial sources. You know, we've been most countries have been reliant on donor aid to the extent that other incentives to look at alternative ways to finance development have actually been limited, as well as, you know, debt repayment on financial loans that have been has also led to the fact that you have less revenue to support your social obligations as countries. So when you look at now, just going back to the BEPS process that Marianne has already highlighted, it's quite critical to highlight that currently Africa is not really engaged, is not involved on an equal footing, and it's quite important that we start putting this pressure to ensure that Africa is on an equal footing when it comes to engagements, interactions, and so that it's just something that we would have to rubber stamp, but actually to ensure that things that we demand for are on the agenda. And I think South Africa plays an important role in this instance because taxation is also something that is looking at the Davis Commission that's currently underway is actually quite critical. And I think for South Africa as a voice for the rest of Africa is quite important. Although right now there's no formal mandate, I think there's more need for African countries to actually rally behind South Africa and take this opportunity to push through the agenda and ensure that South Africa takes those kind of things. Although there's also a balance between South Africa's interests and the rest of Africa's interests, in the sense that these are countries that have got diverse economic structures, and there has to be a balance for South Africa on its own interests as also pushing the interests of the rest of Africa. So going forward, I think there has to be a way to ensure that African countries get involved, and I think there are certain platforms. The UN Tax Committee is one of them, although obviously some of these committees haven't really been pushing through, but I think African countries can take this opportunity to ensure that they speak. It's no longer a time to just sit around and complain, but actually to be proactive in some of these issues because they are quite critical for the development of this continent.